In this last video on metabolism, we're going to talk about fermentation. And I just put a little bit of history here because it's pretty important history in science and in microbiology. A scientist named Louis Pasteur, a French scientist that probably a lot of you have heard of, he discovered fermentation in 1857, the mid-1800s. Now, it turned out at that time, people didn't even know that microorganisms cause disease. And so Louis Pasteur, there weren't microbiologists. People didn't study microbiologists as a career because they didn't really even know what microorganisms were doing. And so Louis Pasteur was actually a pretty famous chemist at the time, and he would get merchants having problems with making wine. And they made wine from all sorts of stuff, beet juice and grape juice and all sorts of fruits and vegetables. But to make wine, you need to produce alcohol, and you need a fermentation. And sometimes the fermentation would work, and they would get alcohol, and other times they'd get vinegar. And it was very, it was kind of an art to it because they didn't know the science behind it. They actually didn't even know that microorganisms were involved. They knew you had to do things like put the beet juice in a container and seal it up and keep it at a certain temperature and do it for a certain time. But they didn't know microorganisms were involved. And so Louis Pasteur started studying this, looking at the different juices as they were fermenting under the microscope. And he ended up seeing yeast. And he was able to prove definitively that the yeast were producing alcohol, and that it was actually the microorganisms that were causing the formation of the wine. And learning about that helped them learn a lot more about how to control what organisms were there and which ones were going to make wine and which ones were going to make vinegar and whatnot. But there's this period in time that started in 1857 that was called the Golden Age of Microbiology. And the discovery of the mechanism of fermentation was actually the first event in the Golden Age of Microbiology. Because what happened after that is scientists kind of collectively started saying, oh, if microorganisms can change beet juice into wine, could they possibly be changing a healthy person into a sick person? It made people realize that maybe microorganisms were involved in a lot more things than they were aware of at the time, and that there became a dramatic surge in the study of microbiology that led us to where we are today. So let's talk a little bit about fermentation. In your lecture study guide, you have tables like this, and we were talking about aerobic respiration, where oxygen is the final electron acceptor, it turns into water. And then we talked about anaerobic respiration, where things like sulfate and nitrate and carbonate can pick up that last electron and keep all of this going. So aerobic respiration, we needed oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, we had something other than oxygen as the final electron acceptor. Now, not all bacteria can do anaerobic respiration, but there are some microorganisms that can grow anaerobically using fermentation. Notice we have glycolysis here and a couple other steps. No input of oxygen. So fermentation can only happen in the absence of oxygen. And I put in this other picture in your notes just to give you a little more detail, but it's the same thing. Here we have glucose to pyruvate, glucose to pyruvate. There's glycolysis. In fermentation, instead of pyruvic acid going to the Krebs cycle, it goes into other end products, other organic end products. And so depending on the kind of microorganism, some of them will make lactic acid, some of them will make ethanol. I'll show you some examples of some other things that are made. And so this process is fermentation. Now, one of the things you notice is, you remember we get a lot of ATP out of the electron transport chain. But fermentation doesn't have an electron transport chain. We only get these measly 2 ATPs. So when an organism is growing using fermentation, it's going to grow pretty slowly. It doesn't have a lot of fuel for growth. So they grow relatively slowly. Here's some examples of how we've used fermentation commercially. There's all different pathways. These are just 2 pathways to making some of these end products. But there's lots of different microorganisms that make all sorts of different end products. So here's some of those examples. There's the lactic acid and the ethanol that I showed you on the previous page. But there's other things like acetic acid, that's vinegar. Butyric acid has a buttery flavor. And so you can see that there's all different kinds of microorganisms that cause this. If you go look at your yogurt container, we can produce yogurt. Look at the label and you'll see Streptococcus and Lactobacillus because they use fermentations to make lactic acid, and that acid is involved in creating yogurt, cheeses, and sauerkraut. So you're eating these bacteria along with these products. Different ones, we have different kinds of yeast are contributing to making beer and wine. Different kinds are contributing to making vinegar and other things. The Swiss cheese is from the gas produced by some bacteria, makes holes in the cheese as it's being made. So we've been able to use fermentations to make a lot of commercial products. The last thing I want to mention, actually I'm going to mention 2 more things. I'm going to tell you one more thing here. So we're talking about, just to back up, when you took AMP or when you take AMP, humans do aerobic cellular respiration. All of our cells are doing this all the time. We do a little fermentation. Probably most of you are aware when you've exercised a lot, your muscles start getting kind of like they're burning, they're accumulating lactic acid. So why do your muscles start making lactic acid? Because you're running out of oxygen. You're running out of oxygen, your cells can't keep aerobic cellular respiration going, so your muscle cells at a last-ditch effort settle for making a little bit of ATP, and they produce lactic acid. Now, they can't keep doing this very long. Once your muscles start burning, there's a point at which you're just going to have to stop because you're going to run out of energy. You're not getting enough ATP in a fermentation. So humans do aerobic cellular respiration, a little bit of fermentation. We do not do anaerobic respiration. Here's the last thing. It's just a table summarizing our 3 different ways that organisms can catabolize carbohydrates. We have aerobic respiration, and remember the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain is oxygen, and we get a lot of ATP. Anaerobic respiration, these are organisms that can use things like nitrate, sulfate, and carbonate to make things like hydrogen sulfide and methane. And depending on the organism, they're going to make 1 to 32 ATP. So they're going to grow a little bit more slowly than if you grew aerobically. And finally, fermentation, they don't have an electron transport chain, so they don't have a final electron acceptor. And they're only going to make a little bit of ATP, so they're going to grow really slowly. But, hey, if you don't have oxygen, that's your only choice. There you go. That's what you do. All right. That's the end. Good luck.